Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to IIBA Ireland chapter webinar. It's been a while, but we've been busy doing other things such as in-person events and other types of online sessions, like the Lean Coffee, amongst others. So today, 5th of June 2024, the topic of today's webinar is the power of persuasion. And surprise, surprise, we have two speakers today. We have Paddy and Grant. As usual, this webinar will follow the usual agenda. I will start by introducing the speakers. We will go straight into the presentation itself, or presentations, if you wish. And at the end, we will have some minutes for Q&A. So any answers that you might have, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section of the webinar, and they will be addressed at that point. Sometimes it happens. If by any reason either the chat or the QA is disabled, please let me know, and I will fix it during the webinar. Okay, so without further ado, let me start by introducing, in this case, the speakers. First, let's start with Paddy. So Paddy has been a finalist for Best Content Creator at the Creative Industry Awards. He's also a guest lecturer at University of Birmingham on the MBA program. He's currently the Agile Practice Director at the UK's largest tech training organization. He is a former head of Agile Learning for a global investment bank, and he hosts the Superpower Schools podcast, focusing on the human side of tech. So a lot of things happening. We're very happy to have you here today. Paddy, thank you. Also, last but not least, let's welcome Grant. Grant has over 20 years of experience delivering enterprise scale transformation. He specializes in government and financial service sectors. He is the principal consultant and director of Scarlet Solutions, a UK-based consultancy agency. He also has expertise in business analysis and transformation and agile product management. And he's passionate about visual thinking, the visual thinking's ability to generate creative ideas. Welcome, Grant. And without further ado, Paddy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Juan. We'll just get the slides up and then we'll kick off. There we go. Awesome. So first of all, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Just to clarify, my name is Pardeep, but everyone calls me Paddy, and it's just ironic that we're speaking to the Ireland chapter. So I feel right at home, even though I don't have a single bit of Irish blood in me, but I pretend I do whenever I'm in Dublin. So today's session is called The Power of Persuasion, How to Create Change Through the Art of Storytelling. And the reason why this is so important, we believe, is because we live in an age where attention spans are shrinking, and it's really important that as BAs we're able to get that attention span from our stakeholders and other colleagues when we're trying to articulate our ideas. And so in today's session, we're going to be throwing in a few surprises. We're going to talk about egg whisks, cocktails, and koalas. So stay tuned for that. And Grant, do you want to quickly say hello as well before we jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Paddy, and thanks everyone for having Paddy and I on the webinar today. And yeah, hopefully you'll learn a little bit about storytelling and how you can weave that into your BA practice.
Brilliant. And by the way, you'll see the Visual Jam logo on some of the slides. That's a community that Grant and I set up about three years ago during lockdown, and we run regular meetups. So if you are interested in continuing your visual thinking journey, then please do look us up on the Meetup app, and feel free to join some of our events on there.
Malfunction. Need input.
Input. All right. You got it. Okay. This is a picture of an aardvark. See that? It's an aardvark. It's a mammal.
Input. Art for Abyssinia. Adam Dunk, Adam Dunk, Adam.
Holy crow, you can read!
Input. More input.
Okay, no problem. Volume 2, no problem.
More input, Stephanie. More.
There isn't any more. You've read everything in the house.
Wow, it's scary how true that video is right now in the age that we're living with in terms of AI and just the sheer amount of information that we're being bombarded with. And so, welcome to Generation Z. The kids of today are used to taking input like that, and that's from a video called Short Circuit, just in case anybody hasn't seen that before. It's an awesome movie. But what we once thought was science fiction is fast becoming a reality in today's world. And go to the next slide, sorry, Grant. And when we're giving presentations, it's super important that we engage with our audience. So if we were all in a room together, I'd ask if anyone here has given a presentation. I'm fairly sure we would get the majority of the hands go up. And even if you don't deliver formal presentations, most of us have to present in some shape or form during our careers, whether that's an interview where we're presenting ourselves, whether it's a sales pitch, or explaining difficult and complex concepts. Sometimes we present at team meetings and team briefings. So presentations are within our DNA, and I think especially as business analysts. However, if I were to ask you, what makes a presentation rock? I'd love to hear what you say. So feel free to type in the chat. What makes a presentation rock? Oh, we have lots of quiet people. There we go. It's coming through now. Awesome. Ola says, images, not words. And Michelle says, interaction and engagement. Love those. When the audience connects and engages. Lalita, thank you so much. And Laura says, engaging content and engaging presenters. Grant, when people engage in the chat. Awesome. Storytelling, fun. Yes. So please don't be shy, folks. We would love for you to engage with us today. Infotainment. Love it. So those are definitely some of the things that make presentations rock. But what about the things that make a presentation suck? So what leads presentations to be bad? Are there any particular themes that you've seen? Oh yeah, presenting material that the presenter doesn't actually know. Absolutely. Many bullet points. Love that one. I think you might have seen our slides before. When we're reading the slides, absolutely. When there's lots of information on the slide and we're just reading it. Too much text. Lalita, I love that. You've nicely given me a segue into my next slide. So this is a real slide, believe it or not. And our good friend, Ben Crothers, who's a author and a visual thinker, he posted on LinkedIn this exact image. And he was saying how he joined a meeting and he saw this slide and immediately he switched off, because he said, although this slide probably has some really good information, the information is just buried deep within all of that text. And so it becomes really difficult for us, if we're in the audience, to really digest those key points. So we want to make sure that we do all those good things that you've mentioned, in terms of having lots of visuals, reducing the amount of text, and really being clear in terms of the key messages on each slide. Now, the problem is we can have the best ideas, But if we're unable to communicate them in a way that gets people to care, then our ideas will never take flight, like this poor little bulb. And it's a bit like cooking. So we can have the best possible ingredients, but if we don't know how to bring them together, then unfortunately the meal won't taste particularly great. And we believe in order to give a great presentation, there's 3 core aspects that we need to be cognizant of. So first of all is the message. And the message is super, super important. If we continue our cooking analogy, imagine you're going out for a meal and think of the message as almost the taste of the food. It's the core of a really good meal. And without this, you just won't have an enjoyable experience. And then we have visuals. Now, the visuals help to really reinforce and amplify our messages. So having really good visuals is super, super important. And imagine that food coming on a plate. It may be delicious, but if it doesn't look visually appealing, then unfortunately, we're not going to particularly enjoy the meal until we really dive into it. And then thirdly, it's the delivery. And that's a bit like the customer experience that we receive in the restaurant. It's the way that the food arrives to the table, the way the waiter engages with us in terms of whether they're engaging, whether they just come along and drop the food and then run away. So the delivery is super, super important, and having great slides on their own isn't enough. Now, we couldn't possibly go through all 3 of these today because we just don't have enough time, but we're really going to focus on the message. So how do you make sure that your message is on point and people care?
But before we can create a compelling message, first we need to think about our audience. Without understanding our audience, we run the risk of talking about what we know, which isn't necessarily what our audience actually needs. So when you're giving a presentation, take some time to think about who your audience is. What's their context? Why are they here? What do they need from your presentation? A good way to think of this is to try and complete the following sentence. After this presentation, the audience will ... And in that ... think about what your audience will feel, what they will do, what they will know having received your presentation. Now, one word of caution when you think about what your audience will know, as we've already said, we need to make sure we're thinking about what the audience needs to know, not what we know. So we need to think about why they need to know it. Because what we want to do is we want to move from just informing our audience to transforming our audience in some way. You see, most presentations are about change. We're trying to transform our audience in some way. You know, maybe you're giving a presentation about a solution proposal to solve a particular problem in your organization. You might be wanting to then get your audience from being unclear about what the problem is and the best way to solve it, to having clarity as to your recommendations to the way forward and the rationale for that. Maybe you've just delivered some change, some software perhaps, and you're wanting to roll that out across the business. And you are giving a presentation to the impacted teams. You want to transform those teams from feeling maybe obligated to accept the change and not really understanding why they've got to go ahead with the change, to being on board with the change, to being supporters and advocates of the change. And if you're trying to maybe sell something, you need to move your audience from being aware of the product or service that you're talking about to being in a position where they're willing to buy. So the point is that in all instances, we want to transform our audience in some way. And in order to do this, we need to give the audience a reason to care. So we need to think about not only who they are, but what are their needs, what are their objectives, And from that, we can think about what transformation we want our audience to go through. So once you've thought about your audience, and there can be more than one audience segment that you consider when you're delivering a particular message, but what we want to get really clear on next is our core message. What is that big idea or that key point that we want our audience to remember? So you can think of your core message a bit like an elevator pitch. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. But kind of tying into Paddy's introduction about the modern world and the distractions and things like that. Think of it like a tweet. You've got 280 characters, roughly 70 words, to get really clear on what you're trying to say in your presentation. In the words of Gar Reynolds, author of Presentation Zen, you need to think about what you're saying, but why your audience should care. And so in order to do this, Paddy and I were researching different ways in which we could kind of think and put some structure around that core message. Some of you may have heard of Simon Sinek's Golden Circle from his book, Start With Why. Now that book is really focused on leadership and how great leaders communicate inside out by starting with their why, their purpose. And they do that so that you appeal to the limbic brain first. You talk about the why and the how before you move on to the what, the mechanics of what you're wanting to get into. And that way, when you tap into the how, that appeals to the limbic brain. That's the part of the brain that controls trust and decision making. It's your gut that makes decisions. And then once you've got past that, you can think about the what, the practical steps and the things you want people to understand in more detail. And that's where you then tap into the neocortex, the rational, analytical, logical part of the brain. But the point is, you need to think about that motivational side. You need to make the audience care first. And so we pull together a structure that allows us to kind of think about that core message and how you might approach it. So let me explain what I mean by that. So we've got our why, our how, and our what. And so if we start with why with our core message, let's give an example. Paddy mentioned the Visual Jam earlier, the meetup community, the visual thinking community that Paddy and I run together. If we were trying to convince you to join the Visual Jam, then we want to start with why it's important in our core message in our presentation. So our why is we believe that we can unlock creative potential, and that helps us connect on a human level and work more effectively together. So what we're trying to do is create connection. The how is the part that Paddy mentioned. It's we get people along who speak about visual thinking. So we get the best in the business to help communicate different ways that you can apply visual thinking. And the what is effectively the call to action that we want to happen on the back of our presentation. In this case, come along to our free visual thinking community and join in the learning. So that's just a simple way that you can think about your next presentation. Think about the why, the how, and the what of your core message.
Now, stories have been used for generations to pass messages from one generation to another. And way before people could read and write, our ancestors used to use stories to explain how the world works or to teach each other things. So stories are within our DNA. But the real power of stories is how they help create that emotional connection. Because without emotional connection, people are less likely to be persuaded by our ideas or explanations. So let's explain that through an illustration. So in 2009, journalist Rob Walker, he ran a social experiment where he used what we call significant objects was the name of the social experiment. And he wanted to prove just how powerful storytelling can be. So if there's any budding entrepreneurs on the webinar today, then please take note, because we're going to give you some golden tips for when you're next on eBay. So during the experiment, Rob and his colleague purchased 100 items, and they're all pretty cheap tat, really. So there were these 100 items that cost them a total of about $129. They then listed them on eBay. But instead of just using standard descriptions for each of the objects, they replaced those descriptions with short stories about the items. Now, they also got a bunch of creative writers to write those stories who were participating in the experiment. And those stories were fictitious. They weren't actually real stories. But the customers buying the objects at the time weren't aware of that. And so let's see what happened when they did this experiment. So this is an egg whisk. And in this example, this item had the following story. It was all about a man who had just had a heart bypass. And the man loved making extravagant 10-egg omelets. But he used to make them for his lovers. And that led to high levels of cholesterol, which then in turn led him to have this surgery. Now, the story was told from the perspective of the man's wife. And the writer describes how the man brought his infidelity into the couple's home. And that resulted in the wife packing up her bags and taking her husband's favorite egg whisk with her. And now she was listing this item on eBay. Now, I have a question. Oh, back, quick. Oh, okay. Okay, we saw the first answer. Okay, I'll just go for them. For the first answer, so based on that story, the actual price of that item was only 25 cents. But how much do you think the item sold for with that story included? Some of you may have seen the answer, but don't worry. So in the chat, let's see what people come up with. So how much did it sell for? There we go. Ola says $25, $100 or more. Lalita, you're a mean entrepreneur there. Look at that. She's she's in the money. Brilliant. Anyone else? No, people still thinking. Well, the actual price that it sold for was actually $30. There we go. Now, that's an increase of almost 12,000% based on the original price they purchased it at. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. Don't jump ahead yet, Grant.
Yep.
So, how much do you think all of those items, all 100 of those items, sold for? And so just remember, they were purchased for $129, and each one now had its own story and was put on eBay. So how much do we think all of them combined were sold for on eBay? I'm just patiently looking at the chat, waiting for people's answers. Either that or everyone's gone off and listing their items on eBay. There we go. Right, there we go. Lolita said, now I would say $600 to $800. Michelle says 150. All has gone for 5,000. Wow. Go, brilliant. 1,000 from Roland. I love that. Michelle's so Stephen, sorry, is so precise. 15,480. There we go. I love that. 1,500 from Michelle. Okay, let's put ourselves out of our misery. So they actually sold for $8,000. And as you can see, that's almost 3,000% increase in terms of the price. And so if you sort of take that example, we can give things a certain value through the connection we create. So emotional connection leads to emotional investment. And through emotional investment, our perceived value can increase of something. There's also something called the IKEA effect. And it's a similar example where initially people were asked about different furniture to guess how much the furniture was, and they perceived it as low value. And then those same people were given furniture that they had to assemble themselves. And then they were asked, how much do they think that furniture was? And because they were emotionally invested in that furniture, having actually sweated blood and sweat and tears to actually build that furniture, they gave that furniture a much higher value because they were emotionally and physically invested into it. So people become less critical and less objective when we're able to create that emotional connection and they have emotional investment.
So I want to tell you a little story now about emotional investment from my own experience, and this will help illustrate some of the points that Paddy was making. So this scruffy little character you see on the screen here is my daughter Scarlett's favourite bear, Little Nell. So Scarlett is 17 years old now. She's just passed her driving test. But she got Little Nell when she was 5 years old. She went shopping with her nan in the town where I live, a place called Bridgnorth in Shropshire. And Bridgnorth is a nice historic market town. But in terms of the shops there's not a great choice. There's a few charity shops, and this is where Scarlett and her nan were browsing around those local charity shops, and she found this little koala bear. And so she persuaded her nan to buy her this little koala bear, and she called her Little Nell. And she took Little Nell everywhere with her. So when we were on holiday, Little Nell was there with us, joining in the fun. Little Nell went with Scarlett to her best friend's birthday party, where she was in fancy dress along with everybody else. And Scarlett, when she was a little older, we found that she had problems with her hearing. She had perforated eardrums, and she had to have surgery to do a skin graft on her ear. And to do that, they had to sedate Scarlett and put her to sleep. And as a parent, you're really worried if your child's got to get put under any kind of anaesthetic, never mind put asleep. But luckily for Scarlett, Little Nell was there in hospital with her to look over her and make sure that she was okay. And when Scarlett's baby sister was born, Little Nell was also there to keep her baby sister entertained. So the point I'm making really is that Little Nell was a huge part of Scarlett's life. Now, fast forward a few years, and every year in Bridgnorth, there's a town carnival that happens over a bank holiday weekend. It happened just recently. And in that carnival, there's a procession. It starts off in the high part of town, and it follows a route through town where you have kind of floats, and you have the carnival prince and princess. That's my other daughter, Talia, there as the carnival princess in the white. And in that particular carnival, Scarlett was taking part in the procession. So Scarlett is a cheerleader. She competes for England internationally, and part of her cheerleading duties was to promote the squad and to participate in the carnival. And so the procession was going on, and Scarlett wanted Little Nell to come along and join in the fun. So we had little Nell with us, and Scarlett participated in the procession. And again, as a parent, it's horrifying because Scarlett is the flyer. And anybody who knows anything about cheerleading, the flyer is the one that gets thrown up in the air and the others have to catch your daughter. So it's terrifying to watch. But luckily, Scarlett made it safely through. And when the procession finished, it kind of culminated in a fair in Lowtown down by the river. And that's where there's lots of candy floss and rides and all kinds of fun going on. And the day kind of carried on and everybody had a good time, but you might be able to guess where this is going. In all of the excitement, Scarlett lost little Nell. She came, she tugged on her mum's skirt and said, Mum, she was distraught. She's like, Mum, I can't find little Nell anywhere. And we're looking around trying to retrace her steps. Where'd you have little Nell last? And I'm going up to people saying, excuse me, have you seen a koala bear? And they're like, well, we live in Bridge North. What do you mean? No, it's a cuddly toy. Have you seen this cuddly toy? It's my daughter's. It's really important to her. And we were really struggling to find this koala bear. And at that point in time, if somebody had have popped a ransom note through my door and said, you know what, pay me £1,000 or the koala gets it, I would have probably paid it because it meant that much to Scarlett. She was so upset and so distraught. Now, luckily, there is a happy ending. My wife was smart enough to go on Facebook, go on some local community groups, post some pictures of little Nell, and luckily, somebody managed to spot little Nell, and she was finally reunited with Scarlett. And now, like I said, Scarlett's 17 years old. You know, she's way too cool for childish toys, and yet little Nell still takes pride of place on her bookshelf next to the picture of her and her best friend. Now, by telling you this story, I'm starting to create some kind of emotional connection with you simply because I've opened up a little. You know a bit more about me. I'm not just a guy who talks about business analysis stuff. And Paddy's now going to talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of presentations and storytelling.
Thank you, Grant. I love that story every time I hear it. So it has a similar impact for me. And sometimes Grant actually brings little Nell with him whenever we're abroad and actually presenting live. There you go. There's a great TED talk by a guy called David J.P. Phillips, and he is a master storyteller. And he says when storytelling is done well, we can create what he calls the angel's cocktail. And this is where we can actually influence different chemicals in people's brains through the way we tell stories. So it's a little bit of a hack that we can use through storytelling. So dopamine is one of the chemicals that we can help influence in someone's brain. And with dopamine, it can be triggered when we start to create suspense or have certain types of cliffhangers in the story. And what this does is it really increases focus. So people are eager to know what's going to happen next. It can help them get more motivated and also remember things. So I guess, Grant, question to you, in your story, how did you influence our dopamine in that story?
So the most obvious example, I think, is the point that little Nell went missing. There was that element of suspense. Will she be found? Has she been kidnapped? And I think if I'd have just stopped the story there, people would have probably been a bit frustrated because you want that resolution to that story.
Brilliant. And then we have oxytocin. And this chemical can be triggered where we create emotion, some kind of human connection, empathy. And what this does is it gets us to really start to trust the presenter. We start to bond with them as well. And it's great for getting the audience to warm to you if you can create empathy in your story. And once again, how did you do that in your story, Grant?
So I think this story's got lots of little points throughout it where, you know, you you sort of recognize Scarlett's love for little Nell and sharing little Nell with her baby sister. I think my love for my daughter, my willingness to pay £1,000 to get the bear back, all those things. And I think even the kind of visuals and the element of Scarlett being in hospital, I think as well, just little things like that, just help you become a bit more human to your audience.
And finally, probably my most favorite chemical of the brain is the endorphins. And the way we create more endorphins in the brain is through humor and laughter. So when we're able to crack a joke or two, it gets our audience to laugh, which is great, but it helps us create an atmosphere of relaxation and, again, warming to the presenter as well. And we can also get the audience to feel a little bit more creative because we let our guards down and we're in a different type of mindset. And you can use these chemicals in not just storytelling, but even if you're running some kind of workshop and you want people to go through certain types of emotion, you can then trigger them through some form of story. And again, how did you do that in your story?
So that particular story, I don't think it's a case of, cracking dad jokes throughout the story or anything like that, although we've
Thank
got
God.
plenty that we could inflict upon you. But the visual of little Nell with the gas mask on is enough to raise a smile. Joking about the ransom note and those kind of things, it just makes things a little more lighthearted, and ultimately it just makes your audience feel more comfortable. If you're relaxed and having fun, so do they.
Great. And on the flip side, we also have the devil's cocktail. So these are sort of chemicals that we want to control and not increase too much because they can have a negative impact on your audience. And so cortisol and adrenaline. Now, a lot of people might think, well, adrenaline's a great thing. It's something that really gets, the blood pumping in our veins and all of that good stuff. But actually, in storytelling, it can be seen as a bad thing. And the best example I can think of is imagine watching a horror film and then all of a sudden you see this monster appear from nowhere, or you get startled and you feel that adrenaline through your body, but it's not a nice feeling. And what we don't want is to startle our audience or create that fear in them, which might create that adrenaline. And what can happen then is, the audience will experience these negative emotions. So they can become uncreative. They could become more critical and could lead to bad decisions as well. So we want to try and avoid those. So as we can see, storytelling done well can induce those great hormones in terms of the angel's cocktail. But equally, if we do them badly, if we do storytelling badly, it can actually backfire as well. So we need to be really careful how we use these chemicals.
So now we've explored why storytelling is useful, let's touch briefly on what is the structure of a good story. And there are lots of different storytelling models out there that we can call upon. I'm going to talk just through a few, and you'll see they've got some kind of common patterns. So the first and probably oldest one is Freytag's pyramid. So 19th century German novelist Gustav Freytag analysed the common elements of plots in stories and novels of his time. And he came up with this pyramid, which he saw as kind of common patterns that he saw in those stories. The start of the pyramid is the exposition, the positioning of how things are at the start of the story, the ordinary world today. And then there's some kind of inciting incident that results in a change. And then we have rising action, a climax, and falling action, which is the middle of our story. And we get to the point where we have a resolution and an ending where the story is drawn to some kind of conclusion. Another popular variant is the hero's journey. So this was originally popularized in 1949 by Joseph Campbell, but it was repopularized in 2007 by a guy called Christopher Vogler. And he talked about the writer's journey and being a structure for creating screenplays. And what's interesting is this is a different structure, but it's not that dissimilar to Freytag's Pyramid. We have the start of the hero's journey, Act 1, if you like, which is what the world is like today for our protagonist. And then there's some kind of trigger to call to adventure, and then eventually crossing the threshold into the middle part of the story, where the hero goes through a series of trials and challenges, and eventually they move into Act 3, where it's the road back. They've learned something or experienced something that's changed them in some way. And an interesting little fact on this one is George Lucas actually rewrote the script and the sequencing of Star Wars Episode 4 once he came across the original hero's journey structure. He actually restructured the story, and that went on obviously to be a massive hit, and it has been replicated many times since. But one of the simplest and probably the most popular structures is the Pixar story spine, created by a guy called Ken Adams. And again, it's quite a familiar structure. We have Act 1, where we meet the characters in their current setting. So once upon a time, this character did this every day until one day, an inciting incident, a trigger of some kind, changed something, and we move into Act 2. And in Act 2, we have the trials and challenges. Because of that, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's your rising action. And then finally, we have that return to the new world. Ever since this big conclusion, our hero has now learned something, and Pixar love to throw an extra bit, which is the kind of the moral of their story in there as well. So if you look at each of these points, Pixar talk about these being story beats, like a drum beat. And these are the kind of key points in a story. So it's kind of like a highlights reel, I suppose. If I asked you to summarize your favorite film, you could sit there for hours and talk me through it. But if you just summarize the 8 key points that happened, that's the essence, that's the spine of the story structure. And there's a great example from Pixar, which is The Incredibles, where you might think on the face of it, The Incredibles is a story about superheroes fighting bad guys. But the moral part of it, the change that's described through that story, is how Mr. Incredible, from the start of the film, is downtrodden, working in a dead-end job. And then through reconnecting with his family and going through various adventures with them, he rediscovers his mojo. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, I couldn't resist testing the story spine with one of my favorite childhood films. So apologies if you're too young to have ever seen Back to the Future, but if you haven't, you really should. But this structure works for something like that, you know, at a really high level. The Act 1 is positioning what the world is like for our protagonist, Marty McFly, at the start of the film. It's set in 1985, and Marty is friends with a crazy old scientist. And every day, Marty spends time with his family, who are all miserable and unfulfilled, until one day, Doc Brown reveals his latest invention, should I say, which is a time machine. Things go wrong, and Marty accidentally ends up getting sent back in time to 1955. Through that, there's a series of events. He meets his parents as teenagers. He causes his mum to fall in love with him. And then because of that, he then needs to seek out a younger version of Doc Brown to help him work out how to correct the mess that's happened, to avoid him and his family being wiped from existence. So he decides to befriend his father and stand up to the school bully so that his dad can win the heart of his mum again and fix the space-time continuum. And eventually, the big conclusion is when he has to harness the power of a lightning bolt, the only way that he can get enough energy to get him back to the future. And ever since then, we have the new world, the happier, more fulfilled version of Marty and his family. So that's the kind of idea behind this. You can summarize a whole bunch of action in a few key points. Now, sticking briefly with my Back to the Future theme, when we're talking about storytelling in our presentations, we need to recognize that we are not the hero of the journey. It's our audience that are the hero. We're the mentor. So in my example, we're Doc Brown, the audience is Marty McFly. Or maybe we're Yoda and they're Luke Skywalker, or we're Gandalf and they're Frodo. You get the point. Our job is to guide the audience through their journey so that they can go through that transformation I described earlier. Now, when we're presenting or explaining something, we're typically not telling stories in that theatrical sense. We can throw in anecdotes to make a point, but generally, we're not kind of going through the story arcs I just described in exactly that way. But we still need to take our audience on an engaging journey. And so Nancy Duarte, in her 2010 book Resonate, talked about a pattern that she spotted in great speeches and presentations. So she analyzed speeches from Martin Luther King Jr. to Abraham Lincoln to Ronald Reagan. And what she found was they had kind of a common pattern. They all jumped back and forth in a contrast between how things are and how they could be. So at the start of the presentation, they would often open with the grey bit, which is positioning how the world is now, the problem we need to overcome, or sometimes the opportunity that is staring us in the face. And then there are a series of arguments that are made throughout the presentation to convince your audience. Those are kind of like those story beats, those key points on the way through that you want to make, but doing it in such a way that you're continually contrasting with the problem and the solution, what the world could be like, that creates that contrast and that interest. And then finally, the climax, the grey bit at the end, where we leave on a high and we summarize the audience, our core message. We play back to them what the key outcome is, what the new bliss is that we want them to seek out. So when Paddy and I were preparing for this presentation, we decided to kind of, walk the walk, I suppose, right, Paddy? We got together, we got our Post-it notes out, and we thought about what we wanted to say, and then we restructured it to think about our sparkline. We consciously thought about how to position the opening. We thought about the key arguments and the points we wanted to make on the way through, and how we could contrast between the problem and the ways past that problem. And we also talked about how we could leave with a big conclusion, which in a second, Paddy's going to share a fantastic ending that's going to leave you all amazed when you walk away from this presentation. Right, Paddy? No pressure.
Yeah.
But before Paddy gives his grand finale, just a few things that are really practical when we're talking about this approach. The first thing is, when you're giving a presentation, try to avoid the temptation to just jump straight into PowerPoint and open up the tool. Because if you do, you get a default slide that looks like this. And at the start of our presentation, when Paddy asked you what sucks in a presentation, we all talked about bullet points and too much text being a bad thing, right? So resist the urge to go straight to the bullet points. Instead, go analog, get out your Post-it notes and your Sharpies and think about how to generate your ideas, organize them into a meaningful structure. Think about how you position the beginning, the middle, the end. What are the key story beats you want to give on the way through? And that way you will come up with a much better thought out structure that you can then open PowerPoint or whatever your chosen tool is to give that presentation.
Okay, grand finale. No, it's not that great. So if there's just one thing that you take away from this presentation, because we've probably bombarded you with a fair amount of information, let it be this. If you keep your audience in mind and focus on how you can make them care about what you're trying to say, then you're halfway there. And if you do that, then you should try and understand your audience, get clear on your core message, create that emotional connection through storytelling, and use those story structures to contrast and create interest and engagement. And if we can do all of that, then maybe, and just maybe, our ideas will take flight so that we no longer have this miserable little bulb, and hopefully ideas will flourish out there into the big wide world. And on that note, we just want to thank you guys for joining us today, because we appreciate it's late in the evening and you've probably had a hard day's work. So we do appreciate you hanging around and actually listening to us this evening. Just want to leave you with one last thing. So Grant and I, we often get asked about how do we put together our slides, and there should be a little video playing in here any moment. There we go. Is it playing? No? Oh yeah, there we go. Because we often hear people give PowerPoint a bad name and talk about death by PowerPoint. But we believe PowerPoint doesn't have to be boring, because you can do some amazing things with this tool, and it's all about how we drive it. So Grant and I, we put together a little mini course to help BAs and others put awesome slides together. And you're seeing a little sample of some of the slides that we've created for some of our talks in the past. So on the course, we're going to be breaking these down step by step as to how you could create visuals and slides like these, so that hopefully when you're trying to engage with your audience, then you'll be able to create that connection as well. So if you're interested, then there's a QR code there. And I think Grant's pasted the link as well. And we're offering a 25% discount as well, especially for you guys. So that's it. Juan, over to you, my friend. And we'll take any questions before we let everybody go.
Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Grant. Great presentation, super engaging, and you're right. PowerPoint makes a world of difference. That's it, guys. So as Paddy mentioned, it's Q&A time. So I haven't seen so far any questions either on the general chat window or under the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, now is the time. Or be silent forever. So just give it a couple of seconds to see if there are any questions from anyone. Meanwhile, Paddy, Grant, are there any other trainings or something that you would like to advertise? Do you have any training plans for the near future, or any other events or sessions that you would like to talk about?
No training as such, but we've got a Visual Jam event coming up, which is next week. That'll be another great session for BAs, right, Grant? If you want to explain what that one's about.
Yeah, so our guest is an expert in Miro, the online collaboration tool, and she's going to be showing how to create visual landscapes that can help you to kind of facilitate meetings and those kind of things and create engagement. But probably the other thing to mention is if you head to the visualjam.com, if you do want to join the community, you can find the link to the meetup community there. We also have a community app where we've got videos of previous events that you can access. And if people are interested more generally in visual thinking, Paddy and I do offer training courses privately for companies as well. The PowerPoint course we mentioned is the one public course we have live at the moment.
Thank you, Grant. One question came through from Patrick. How long did you both take to plan the session before creating it?
Yeah, this particular one was an interesting one. I think we got the idea together. We knew what we wanted to talk about, and Paddy and I often work this way. We get really enthusiastic about an idea, and we're WhatsApping each other all the time with like, we could do this, we could do this, and then time passes, and we get on doing other things, and then we realize, oh, this deadline for this presentation is coming up. We better get on with it. And
sorry, Grant, I think they call it the student syndrome. Is that it?
yeah, so it's there's people talk about procrastination, right? But
Yeah.
I heard the term that I quite liked. I think it was on a TED Talk where they talked about precrastination. But what that means is you think about it a bit up front, and then you go along and you do other things. And our best creative ideas happen when we're walking the dog or taking a shower or whatever it is. So I like to think that actually Paddy and I have just got this genius process where we think about things up front, we bounce things around, and then we just let our creative juices do the rest of it. But joking aside, it took a while to collate it. We created a Miro board because we were working virtually at the time for this presentation. And we just dropped lots of post-it notes, ideas, snippets, doodles, and it kind of then came together quite organically on the back of that. And then we got together face to face to actually pull together that story spine structure we talked about and actually tighten it up. I think that was how we did it, Paddy.
Yeah, no, 100%. And just to add to that, we often have so many ideas and so much research that we've both been doing, and then we just find there's just way too much for a presentation. And we did that last year as well for the European BA conference in London. We did a talk called The Indistractables, if anybody was there. And that talk, again, we put so much research into it. But then when it comes to the actual talk, we've got to break it down. And that's always a hard bit. It's like, every point is like your baby, and you don't want to take anything out. And sometimes you've got to be really strict, and that we always find that really difficult as to what we should take out. So this year is going to be interesting. We've got another exciting talk at the European BA conference. I won't reveal exactly what it is just yet, but if folks are looking to attend that conference, then yeah, you'll hopefully see our little synopsis on their website.
Brilliant. Thanks for the tip, and thanks also for the mention about the next week event. I think that's great. And I think that's a wrap. So Paddy, Grant, once again, thank you so much for the great presentation. It was wonderful, even after a long day's work. I think it was refreshing and light in a certain way, as you said. A lot of information, but delivered in a light way. I think it was pretty good, honestly. I know I'm biased, but I really think it was pretty good. Paddy, Grant, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you that attended the webinar today. Stay tuned, follow us in the usual channels on our website, on LinkedIn, and keep an eye on our next events. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.